the conditions in a coal mine at this time, to say that they're primitive is, you can't even imagine it.
This is a place where, for weeks or months at a time, men might never see daylight. The mine was often filled with standing water around their ankles and their feet. They had to drink from that water. Disease ran rampant through these mines.
They were incredibly dangerous places to work, being subjected to violent explosions, poisonous gases that were released as coal fell from the walls, in addition to the falling coal itself.
Whippings, keeping people chained up, brutal kinds of physical torture, and mental abuse are the norm. A lot of the things that kept people in control under slavery are amplified under this convict system.
Zeke Archie was one of about 500 convicts at the Pratt Mines near Birmingham, nearly half the company's workforce. They were overseen by J.W. Comer, the former slaveholder, whose enterprises now included convict mining.
That Comer's a hard man. I've seen him. I've seen him hit men 100 and 160 times with a 10-pronged strap. Then say they was not whipped.
When I learned about the brutality of J.W. Comer, I just started weeping. And I actually didn't leave my house for 2 days because I was in such a state of grief and shock. The stories that I heard about all the Comer men when I was growing up were about self-made men. And so to learn about the ways that they weren't really self-made, but were making themselves on the backs and by the blood of other people, specifically the blacks in the convict leasing system, definitely shattered that image for me.
He'd go off after an escaped man one day and dig his grave the same day.
Exposés of the convict labor system described it as worse than slavery. Slaves had been a significant long-term investment. A convict could be rented for as little as $9 a month.
It was never in the economic interest of a slave owner to kill his own slaves or to abuse them so terribly that they couldn't work anymore. So their economic value protected them in certain ways. After the Civil War, someone working these kinds of forced laborers would push them to the very limits of human endurance.
We are the men who do the work. Look at the white men. How many are cutting 5 or 4-ton coal per day? They are few.
Convict leasing was a source of labor where you could realize the maximum return at a minimum social cost. The feeding, of course, was next to nothing. Health was next to nothing.
Convict miners cost as much as 50 to 80% less than free miners, and could be worked 6 days a week. Their presence allowed companies to depress wages and resist unions.
When one could obtain black labor at almost no cost, the profits for that form of business were enormous.
In Florida, prisoners extracted gum and resin from tall pines and transformed it into turpentine. In Georgia, they hauled wet clay from riverbanks, molding it into the millions of bricks needed for new buildings and homes. From Texas to Louisiana, convicts forced their way through acres of virgin forest, harvesting timber and building railroads. In all, more than 15,000 prisoners worked in Southern industry in 1886. And that number was rising quickly. In many labor camps, as many as a third of male convicts were boys younger than 16. Girls and women were also forced into labor.
Over 90% of convict laborers in Georgia were African American men. The next highest percentage would obviously be white men, but African American women were also utilized in these various tasks. In manual labor, Black women are working in brickyards, in turpentine camps, in mining camps, farms, in lumber yards.
Convict leasing becomes a new form of economic development in the South and a ubiquitous form of punishment for Southerners as the criminal justice system expanded itself.
And sweeps would take place all throughout the South, whether it was for a dice game, whether it was for an altercation, whether it was for being mouthy or uppity.
The record of thousands upon thousands of people arrested in this way is everywhere in the South. In the fall, when it was time to pick cotton, huge numbers of Black people are arrested in all of the cotton-growing counties. There are surges in arrests in counties in Alabama in the days before, coincidentally, a labor agent from the coal mines in Birmingham is coming to town that day to pick up whichever county convicts are there.
Some charges were serious, but more than 2/3 of all state prisoners at the time of Zeke Archie's arrest, including Archie, were convicted under vague charges of burglary and larceny. County prisoners, too, were sent to the mines. For often trivial offenses, they faced the real possibility of death. In some Alabama prison camps, convicts died at a rate of 30 to 40% a year.
And this system is one that I think in many ways needs to be understood as brutal in a social sense, but fiendishly rational in an economic sense. Because where else could one take a Black worker and work them literally to death after slavery? And when that worker died, one simply had to go and get another convict.
The South's prison population continued to grow, reaching 19,000 people by 1890. Nearly 90% of those held were African American. When folded into national statistics, the concentration of Black prisoners seemed to reflect an alarming rise in Black crime.
So as early as 1890, African Americans are almost 3 times overrepresented in the prison population. The general population is 12%. The nation's prisons population of Blacks is 30%.
So there are many important implications and long-term consequences for this convict leasing system. Not only is it so oppressive, but when you have an overwhelmingly Black prison population, it cements that relationship between criminality and race in people's minds to the degree that it's seen as something inherent.
Southern editorialists, sociologists, politicians are all saying that the statistics prove that Black people are a criminal race and that freedom had been a mistake.
If you were to ask most Southerners, white Southerners, what they thought of African Americans in the 1850s, the 1860s, even into the 1870s, one profile would have been of people who are loyal, dutiful, trustworthy. Those same people in the 1880s and by the 1890s have been demonized. They no longer are trustworthy. They no longer have the capacity for citizenship.
By the 1890s, white voters had reversed the civil rights gains made during Reconstruction. New state constitutions kept blacks out of voting booths and limited funding for black schools. Racial segregation was mandated by law.
They do this because it's important to remind black people day after day after day, minute after minute, that they have a place in this society and that that place is subordinate. So what that means is that when a black person is walking down the street and a white person walks towards them, they step into the gutter.
My name is Barbara Jean Belle-Isle. I was born in Birmingham in 1936. You had to stay in your place. Now, my daddy was the one who was daring. He used to be called that uppity nigger by white folks because he believed that we were just as good as anybody else. He's a smart man. He's one of the first black men in this area to register to vote. There were a lot of times truckloads of KKK folks would pass by the house. He had made white folks mad about something. He wouldn't let my mother work. She went to clean up a house one time, and he went over to pick her up, and she was cleaning out some of the cabinets down there on her knees trying to clean out. He told her, "You're not going back. You cleaned up your own cabinets." And that's the kind of man he was. But he's another story, though, and I have to talk about him at another time.
Segregation was not only mandated by Southern states, it was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in an 1896 ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson.
And after that, white Southerners, white legislatures never had any reservation about imposing the most severe, the most repressive restrictions on black life.
Ezekiel Archie was scheduled for release on February 6, 1887. At the age of 28. But he was not free. A new indictment for reasons unknown was pending.
This letter is not all I could write, but my condition will not permit. Fate seems to curse the convict. Death seems to summon us hence.
As the 19th century came to a close, and for many decades to come, the possibility of freedom was overshadowed by the constant threat of forced labor and violence.
I didn't know it. I didn't know it.
Decades after the Civil War, the nation was reunited, but the place of black Americans within it seemed more uncertain than ever.
Many whites in the South are completely indifferent about whether black people live or die. They want to see them in their place. They want to see them as an exploitable system of labor. They want to see them as an affirmation of their racial superiority. And if they don't fulfill that role, then to hell with them.
Another man done gone, another man done gone. I never will forget this. I'm 9 years old, going from West Palm Beach to Tampa, where my mom's from, to see my grandma. And we had a brand new Oldsmobile, and a cop stopped her in Kissimmee, Florida. And the way he talked to my mom, he gave her a ticket for speeding, and she was not speeding. It was just because he could do it. You follow me? And the ticket cost a 1 month salary. And my mama had to restrain me because I wanted to get after this white boy like I could not believe at 9 years old. When you have to just kind of just tuck it in, like my mom would say, Bernard, you gotta just stop, because we may not get out of here. And you can see the terror in her eyes. You follow me? Because we're in little old Kissimmee in the 50s.